metal there, to traffic lights, to pothole covers. It's just everywhere that there is metal in public spaces, they become a target of thieves. Sometimes small scale, a really tiny bit of metal is stolen, but with massive damage. And at other times, industrial level theft, where there's a level of sophistication with enormous quantities of industrial level copper cable in particular stolen. So we recognize that given how widespread infrastructure is, we're not going to be able to have a police woman or policeman or private security person every single moment watching every single kilometer of what is vulnerable. We've looked at the international experience and how other jurisdictions are addressing the challenge. And effectively what the presentation will show is that policy, the proposed policy, seeks to shift from trying to police thousands of locations to really focusing on the logistics and distribution networks. We believe that from the research that's been done, if we can disrupt those networks, if we can increase the cost on the syndicates, and if we can ensure that those networks don't operate properly, we would be able to win the battle against theft of metal and copper cable. So that we're shifting the focus to logistics of scrap metal trading, from how they export, to the use of cash, to requiring traders to maintain registers of who they buy from and who they sell to. The next slide looks at the international experience, that metal theft is a global problem that many countries are facing. A survey was undertaken for government on the international experience of restrictions on the sale of scrap metal. And the research provides case studies. For example, it goes into a little bit of detail on Kenya, where they banned scrap metal, and India, where they put in place a significant export tax. We've also looked at other measures that deal with trade in scrap metal. And in the case of the European Union, they use environmental standards to address the trade in this. According to a database maintained by the OECD, a number of countries have imposed restrictions on trade in scrap metal. That report indicated 9 countries had formally banned copper scrap exports by 2020. 17 countries had instituted quotas or licensing requirements. 13 countries had imposed taxes, and restrictions included not only copper but also ferrous and aluminium scrap. The next slide looks at the proposed measures that have been set out in the Government Gazette. A 3-phased approach is being considered, although, of course, these phases and what we do in each phase are not rigid and they may overlap. And they're really all intended to limit demand for scrap and to facilitate policing. In phase 1, the focus will be on interventions that can be implemented without delay through the use of either directives or notices. And some of the measures include reducing demand by imposing a temporary 6-month prohibition on the export of waste and scrap metal, facilitating policing by developing a system to make it easier for policing to take place. And it focuses on an export permit system for semi-finished metal products and the creation of an import permit system for furnaces and various other scrap transformation machines. I should pause there and just indicate that one of the challenges that the presentation points to is that when scrap is stolen, there's often an attempt, according to the Genesis report, by traders to disguise the metal or the copper cable. So they would shred the metal, break it into pieces, and then compact those pieces So it's difficult to link it directly to what was the original source of the metal. And the copper cable would be melted into billets, into a form where it can be exported, and the origin of it is not known. Government is also considering limiting export permits for finished or for semi-finished metal products to businesses that manufacture such products, and is looking at developing a central repository to monitor metal theft from critical public infrastructure. In the second phase, the focus is on amendments to regulations and other measures that are aimed at enhancing the registration, the reporting, and the enforcement regime for metal trading. And the possible additional restrictions on the sale of copper scrap and semi-finished copper would be considered if they are warranted. There will be a limitation proposed on which ports and potentially which land borders could be used for the export of waste, scrap, and semi-finished metal, so that SARS can have experts available at those ports that are able to determine and work through the requirements that exporters would have. And there would be policy coordination between South Africa and various bodies outside South Africa, particularly in the Southern African region. In phase 3, one of the proposals that is being considered now is whether a special act of parliament should be drafted for consideration by members of parliament, or whether changes are required to existing acts. There's also discussion on a possible prohibition on using cash in any transaction involving scrap, waste, or semi-finished metal. National Treasury is looking at that, and what changes are required to the law to enable that. And finally, the blacklisting of offenders with appropriate measures in the law. Any legislation that is enacted, of course, will follow a public consultation process. And because changes to legislation will take more time, it's recognized that we can't wait and see the damage to public infrastructure in the meantime. We've got to implement phase 1 and 2 while preparing for phase 3. The next slide essentially summarizes that on 5 August, the DTIC, following consultation within various government departments, published a draft policy proposal on measures to restrict and regulate trade in waste, scrap, and semi-finished metals to limit damage to infrastructure and the economy. The draft policy was published together with policy directives and notices that propose a temporary prohibition on the export of certain products. And in that period, the suspension of the price preference system, requiring export permits for semi-finished products, and requiring import permits for furnaces and other scrap transformation machines. And interested parties were given 21 days up to the 26th of August 2022 to comment on the policy as well as the directives and notices that are in draft form. And so today's meeting is very helpful because it's within that period when we're thinking through the detail of it. This next slide that's on the screen highlights in a bit more detail some of the key proposals and in particular instances their rationale. And the new regime, as we've indicated, is intended to challenge the criminal syndicate's ability to operate, to sell, and to export the stolen goods inter alia by making policing easier. So we've talked about the enhanced border control in phase 1, and a little bit more detail is put there. The enhanced registration conditions for dealers in scrap and in semi-finished metals, the enforcement of registration requirements for sellers of scrap metal and for semi-finished goods, and the reporting requirements. In the reporting requirements, the intention is to require any a holder of scrap metal to have a register that indicate where they bought or obtained the metal from and who they sell it to, so that we're able to connect these, that one is not able to sell more metal than you can legitimately account for as having bought. The next slide continues to provide more detail on the key proposals and their rationale. They, of course, all put out in lots of detail in the Government Gazette, copies of which have been circulated to honorable members. So I'm summarizing this a little bit. They deal with restrictions on who can sell copper scrap and semi-finished copper metal, on enhanced registration conditions for dealing in copper scrap and in semi-finished copper, and restrictions on the import of furnaces and scrap transformation machines. We finally deal with, on this slide, on the prohibition on the use of cash. And the proposed prohibition is intended to make it easier to trace transactions, and that will greatly improve monitoring and enforcement. I should also, just to go back to that slide, indicate that when it comes to the trade in copper, one of the research agencies originally proposed to government that we consider prohibiting the trade of copper completely. We looked at it carefully, and we decided that a complete prohibition on copper trading is not appropriate in the circumstances. So honorable members will see in the Gazette that we've gone for a less onerous requirement, but one that we are advised would still be effective. The next slide looks at the impact, the likely impact of the measures, that the temporary prohibition is intended to assist and the creation of the permit system. They're all intended to assist to a material reduction in theft of metal from the country's infrastructure, as it will eliminate or reduce one of the avenues for monetizing stolen metal. So by reducing demand, we reduce the incentive to break up electricity substations or steel copper cable, because there's not as much need for the product in the market, because one portion of it, namely the export market, is constrained in the period. The intervention will also divert significant volumes of scrap metal to the local market, which will then, it's likely to lead to lower scrap metal prices, which will disincentivize metal theft. So not only will it have a positive effect by limiting exports, but product that would typically have been sold on the export markets are now brought to the local markets, because supply will increase, whereas demand will remain constant. Prices will drop. When prices drop, then it has a chilling effect, a disincentive on theft of metal and copper cable. The temporary export prohibition would not have a significant negative impact on legitimate local upstream collectors and recyclers, as the volumes of waste and scrap that are currently legally exported can be sold locally. It may be, of course, that there's some reduction in demand, but the temporary prohibition on the export of scrap in 2020 was identified as an example where extraordinary measures were introduced. And the enhanced regulation of domestic metal trading and the enforcement will further bolster the country's fight against metal theft. The next slide. Criminals and criminal syndicates will face an increased risk of arrest, as anyone in possession of waste, scrap, or semi-finished metal will be required to present the registration certificate, and for licensed buyers, the incentive and the ability to purchase stolen goods and to whitewash them into the value chain will be greatly reduced. Potential consequences for violating a registration condition will include, of course, arrest, prosecution, and the cancellation of registration. The proposed regulatory measures will allow lawful metal collection, recycling, production, export, and import to continue, but with the constraint of a regulated environment aimed at combating illegal trade in stolen metal. It's expected that the regulatory interventions may lead to a consolidation among scrap metal traders, with informal traders encouraged to formalize their business or to be employed by scrap metal collection enterprises. The consolidation of scrap feedstock supply is likely to result in some reduction in the domestic supply of scrap metal, but the temporary export prohibition and extension of the export permit system is likely to divert volumes of scrap back into the domestic market, offsetting the impact of domestic consolidation. The next slide wraps up really the likely impact, and it says that the net result of the proposed regime might be that the scrap supply to local industries would increase. In any event, given the magnitude of South Africa's metal theft problems, it appears that any negative impact on the local supply of scrap is more than outweighed by the benefits to society through the reduction in the theft of damage to public and other infrastructure, more than outweighed, saving of lives, positive benefits to the economy. The impact on scrap feedstock supply will be closely monitored by a metal trade task force that has been set up. And in order to ensure that the measures are effective, government will need to allocate additional resources to administration and enforcement, including increased monitoring and enforcement at ports and administered resources for licensing. This will have a financial implication for the fiscus, but it's anticipated to be more than outweighed by the economic benefits. The next slide provides a bit of information to the committee on the metal trade task force that I spoke of. It's been set up to develop the systems and coordinate work within government. We're drawing on expertise within the private sector and the public sector. The metal trade task force consists of the NPA, the National Treasury, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, the Department of Public Enterprises, well, of course, responsible for Transit and ESCOM, the DTIC, the National Intelligence Coordinating Committee, the SA Diamond and Precious Metals Regulator, ITAC, which is the Trade Administration Commission, SARS, the police, and the Department of Justice. The next slide is, there we are. This should also be the final slide. And summing up the work, the presentation outlined a number of steps taken to date, including steps to quantify the impact of theft of scrap metal, to identify possible measures to address these, the consultations within government to develop a package of measures that can be implemented, and the publishing of the proposals for public comment. Following the receipt of public comments, we'll be evaluating these. We're already evaluating the submissions that have been made to date, and these will all be taken into account before a final package of measures are provided to Cabinet for consideration. After Cabinet has considered these, various Cabinet members will consider the measures that fall within their mandates to address the challenge of scrap metal and cable theft as outlined in the Government Gazette, in the presentation, and in the amended document that will be adopted by Cabinet based on public comments. So we haven't made a final decision. We're keeping an open mind on the measures that are necessary, and we will be looking at the public comments and thereafter advising Cabinet and then implementing as is required. So, honourable members, that wraps up the presentation in some of the detail of the measures, because they set out in considerable detail in the Gazette. I have not repeated them fully. The presentation really summarizes both the Gazette and the detailed documents, research documents that have also been commissioned by government. I'd like to appreciate the work and the cooperation that we've received, honourable members, from a number of members of the executive and government departments. We've also had feedback, very helpful feedback, from a number of industry players, companies operating in South Africa, that have assisted us to both get a better sense of the measures that are required and the damage on public infrastructure that is visited on our society. I'd like finally to thank the officials for their hard work. There's still a long way ahead, but what this presentation shows is that we are determined to do everything within our power, within the law and the Constitution, to stamp out the organized syndicates that have benefited at the cost of ordinary South Africans, of businesses, of jobs, and while these measures will be subject to public comment, I think the determination that we must take appropriate measures is definitely there across the executive. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity, and Chair, hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. I also note, members, as I'm sure you have done, that there is an apology from Honourable Thring that he's joining another meeting, and also from Dr. Tswaku, who's asked to be excused as he's not feeling well. I hope he feels better soon. Can I now open? I see Honourable Cuthbert, then Honourable Mulder. Can I see other hands for discussion on the presentation by the Minister? Honourable Burns, Mamashe. I think let's start with those hands, and Honourable Mbuyane. Let's start with those hands. We'll take another round. Honourable Cuthbert.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Please excuse me, my video is off, my signal's not that great this morning. Thank you to the Minister for his presentation. And I'd just like to start off by saying, while we agree on the impact and the urgency needed to attend to this serious issue, we are of the view that it's a law enforcement issue and not a trade policy issue. The facts are the Second-Hand Goods Act has not been properly implemented. SAPs are under-resourced to tackle this crime, and local governments are fighting this battle alone. I've been on the ground personally with the teams in our municipalities where we govern to see what the effects are firsthand, and this is exactly why we've put forward a proposal to stem the tide of vandalism and theft of public infrastructure, and also why we have put forward the request for an urgent debate which will be taking place on the 1st of September this year. Just to note a few facts before I ask the Minister a couple of questions. If you look at the data over the last couple of years, there's been a 74% drop in the export volumes of ferrous scrap and a 92% drop in the exports of volumes of copper. But then we've seen an increase of blister copper that has increased from 0.5% to 76% in export volumes. Now, this is, in my view, because people are going out with scrap to tabletop furnaces, melting it down, and then trying to dodge the tariff code so they can export it. So it's not as if people are necessarily exporting the scrap in its raw format, but it's being melted down by people who have not yet been targeted by SAPs and law enforcement, and then being exported. And this particular ban being proposed does not cover any of these facts that I've displayed this morning. If this ban is to go ahead, just for example, in aluminium, there's going to be a 21 billion rand loss if it is implemented. We'd seen that Kenya implemented their ban earlier this year, and they quickly walked it back because it failed to address the theft and vandalism of infrastructure and had serious economic consequences for local jobs and so forth. If you look at the South African ban that we had, there was a 3-month ban in 2020. Before the ban, used beverage cans were about 9 Rand per kilogram, and these are collected by waste pickers. Once the ban had taken effect, they were 3 Rand per kilogram, and nobody wanted to collect them because there was no demand to collect it and the stuff piled up. Now, the thing is that Hulaman themselves actually approached DTIC because it was not being collected and they required this feedstock for their own production of goods. So the fact is, what is not wanted locally is then exported. And if you would have seen that Columbus issued a note earlier this week to state that they're no longer purchasing aluminium scrap because they have a glut of it. So the fact is, where's all the scrap going to go if it's not being exported and there's no local demand? Also, scrap is currently trading below PPS price, yet the export volumes have continued to fall. So where exactly is this stuff being exported in the great extent that it has, that the minister says it has? The other thing is that if the ban was to proceed with all the listed tariff codes, there would be overall a 31 billion economic loss incurred over a year and 15.5 billion over 6 months. That would then be coupled with the fact that we lose the 46 billion. I think it's closer to about 187 billion from this kind of crime. And you could add that on top and must probably end up with over 200 billion Rand in economic loss. Because I can assure you, this ban is not going to work in fighting the scourge. We need law enforcement on the ground. We need to make sure that people who are illegally trading in these metals are put behind bars and are prosecuted. Chair, some questions for the Minister this morning. Could he please tell me what he bases his comment on that the previous ban caused minimal harm to the industry? Because that is not the view that the data indicates. As you'll know, waste pickers will collect glass, paper, and plastic. And if they're not collecting metal, it means no valued add, and there's no incentive to collect. So this means things like wheelbarrows, stoves won't be collected. And these are exactly the kind of products that are exported for international consumption. How are they going to compensate for the loss in income for waste pickers? And also, it has been indicated in a DTIC document that between 300 million and 750 million Rand in landfill space is saved by our municipalities across the country because these waste pickers do what they do. So what is going to happen with all the scrap and where will it physically go if this ban is to be instituted? Now, the whole premise of this ban is obviously due to lobbying of the minister by his working group and ensuring that they get the kind of trade policy that they want to benefit their own businesses and to make sure that the IDC funding that they have received is safe and they are able to make a buck off of it. But that requires either private sector investment in infrastructure or government expenditure in infrastructure. And the private sector are currently on an investment strike. If you look at the percentage of GDP spent on infrastructure spend over the last 12 years, it has been steeply declining. So where exactly is all of this still going to be used in an infrastructure drive? It cannot justifiably said that there is an infrastructure drive when as a percentage of GDP, it has declined significantly over the last number of years. I just want to ask two last questions, Chair. If the exports of scrap metal have declined, but the export of blister copper has increased, could the Minister please explain why there is this phenomenon in his own personal opinion? And then I would like to also point to you, Chair, to ask that with other matters of this nature, we have had stakeholder engagement and we've allowed for all members of the fraternity in a particular industry to come out and present their view. I honestly think it's premature to rely on the fact that there's been 21 days to comment. And I think that we need a formal process where all members of the value chain, right from the top to the bottom, are able to come and provide their view to the committee so that we can provide an informed opinion to the minister. Because I think this is a case of being too hasty and the economic consequences that may be wrought on the South African public have not fully been calculated yet. Whilst we urge government to take action, we need to make sure that we are directing the necessary resources to law enforcement, such as the SAPS, making sure that the NPA has sufficient prosecuting capacity, because we have that relevant legislation in order to be able to root out the scourge. We need to make sure that we take all the necessary steps, and we need to make sure that we are able to protect our economy, because if we fail to do so, then we are in serious trouble as a country.
Thank you, Honourable Cuthbert. Honourable Mulder.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, and good day to you, Honourable Minister Patel. I will be short And my comments and question would be effort to contribute towards a possible solution while recognizing the reality. Honourable Chair, Minister, I was privileged enough to serve in the Gauteng legislature years ago. And I remember when I served on the Portfolio Committee for Community Safety, we did some investigations, oversights, even interprovincial into the same matter that's on the agenda today. Now that was years ago, almost 15, 20 years ago. Well, since then, less has changed for the better, unfortunately, and we're sitting with a huge problem that we've got today. Minister, if we look at scrap metal, without repeating anything that's been said in the presentation today, it's a well-known hot commodity, almost in the same league as diamonds are, or liquor, or even drugs. And if we see the havoc and the devastation that drugs and the misuse of alcohol can cause in society, I think this extraordinary situation calls for extraordinary measures. Now, if one ban the trade on liquor or diamonds or drugs or anything, and in this instance, if there's a ban in place or a restriction on the trade, it will definitely have a serious impact on a detrimental effect on the economy as well, as we've seen with the bans that we've had through the COVID-19 situation. In other words, there will be unintended consequences, and I think Member Cuthbert also referred to that. It is also a fact that this challenge won't be, we wouldn't be able to sort out this situation in isolation. Legal-wise, with the police, and I believe that there's still two things that we need to work on as well. One could impose legislation, yes. One could restrict, and that will most certainly have unintended consequences. But what we also need is a proper policing system, and especially crime intelligence, but not crime intelligence in the police, but crime intelligence in the Department of Trade and Industry. One should actually institute a crime intelligence department within every department, because we knew what challenge we've got with state capture, with corruption, and the same thing is going with in the diamond industry, for instance, and the liquor industry. So it will be the same with the trade in illegal metal and scrap metal, especially there. So that's the one thing. And then lastly, I want to say that we really need to focus on moral regeneration in this country. One can impose as many acts and rules and mechanisms as you want. But if there's not proper policing and there's no morals or moral regeneration in this country, I think that we won't be able to make progress. So I would really call on the Minister and the Department to focus on moral generation and also the policing, and be very careful with the restrictions and the bans, because it will have a serious impact on the economy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honourable Mulder. Honourable Burns Ngamashe.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. And honourable members, Honourable Minister. I think, Chair, perhaps let me start on a lighter note that at least Honourable Cuthbert would find some palliative to realize that I agree with him that this issue come to the Department of Trade and Industry as a consequence of that which ought to have been done at other levels. Of course, reasons may be different a bit. You know, Chair, if you look at the paradoxical symbiosis between what is characterized as black market trade and that which is characterized as white and perhaps blue collar crime. You look at that in relation to the numbers that the minister has actually referred to. We're not talking here of hundreds of thousands. We're talking here of billions of rands. So it tells you that the industries involved here are not small enterprises or small micro businesses. It's big businesses. You look into even the ammunition that they use. It tells you that it's a well orchestrated, sophisticated network aimed at nothing but economic sabotage. And surely, if you look at it as an economic sabotage, you will certainly have to consider advisability of a multi-pronged approach. A multi-pronged approach which will involve probably inter-cluster meetings. Your economic cluster together with your security cluster. Meeting together so as to find the best possible solution that will make it practically manageable for the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition to do its work at the level of ensuring that the trade practices are within a regulated framework and operate within the legal framework. So what this says is that there's lots of work that would have required the intervention at the level of the intelligence. Hence my reference to security cluster. It might be that when it comes to exporting these illicit goods, we may tighten our systems in South Africa, which would mean if we are not very strong in terms of the border management, they may find a way to leave the borders of South Africa and be exported elsewhere. So it's quite important that while it is a matter that we deal with it in South Africa, but also it must be a matter that we are able to deal with it at the level of the region, as well as at the level of the continent. Because the assets we are talking about, though they may be located in South Africa, but these assets belong to the continent. These assets are there for the benefit of the region and the continent. So, through the framework that is there already, your African Continental Free Trade Agreement or Free Trade Area, surely there's a space for that, wherein even all these other countries that are within the continent, so they have a role to play in rooting out this illegal trade practice on around the scrap metals. So my sense, Chair, is that in welcoming the presentation by the minister, we should think about this not only as a South African problem, but we will look beyond South Africa at the level of the region as well as at the level of the continent. And lastly, we must make sure that we strengthen the district development model, so as to ensure that all the spheres of government are able to work together. Because you'll find that some of the contributory elements fall within concurrent competency, others from national exclusive competency. And of course, there will be those that are within the municipal purview. Hence the need for the cooperative governance system, which obviously Section 40 and 41 of the Constitution already talks to that. So this is not just a matter of a policy when it comes to coordination, but it's a constitutional injunction, which we should be looking at so as to ensure that we are able to work together as that team of government spheres, government institutions, working together to achieve a common goal and for a common purpose, so as to ensure that we put an absolute stop to the hemorrhage as it is occasioned by what I characterize here as economic sabotage. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Burns Mamashe. Honourable Mbuyani.
Chairperson, thank you very much. Let me first welcome the presentation by the Minister and also acknowledge what he raises there as very much important. But one, Chair, I just learned in the presentation that there's more than 400,000 kilometers of cable and copper theft. That amounts to a lot of billions due to cable theft. And also I've learned from the report in terms of the scrap metal that addressing a shortage of supply in the domestic market. I just want to check that because in terms of the presentation, the minister has alluded to in terms of the price preference system have been implemented, temporary prohibition has been implemented, export tax has been implemented. So now, because these things seemingly, to a large extent, it expands of the scrap metal as a large extent in terms of the theft of the copper and the metal, causing serious damage, to the infrastructure. That will cause the harm also in the economy. So I want to also establish whether what is the view of the ITEC in the matter, because its role maybe at some stage is to regulate imports and export goods in RSA in South Africa, and also foster economic growth, tariff investigation. I just want to check the view of the ITEC, and also given the fact that there's a serious theft involved, I'll also concur with the latter speaker in terms of intergovernmental to say how can the model DTM, how can the interdepartmentally, SIU, police, trade, SARS have an engagement that it try to deal with this cable theft, because seemingly it's a broad syndicate around, because it involves a lot of people here, a lot of people from the ground, from the white collar crime, as it's been said. So I just want to check that. How can that be in terms of engaging all the departments, coming here with joint and have a joint committee meeting after we've received a report and maybe views from the community to say, what is it that can be done by the department in the entirety? And also look at the issues of border management, because one has already indicated that if this thing has not been imported or exported within, people will take them out of our country and deal with them outside there. And that also will be able to escalate in terms of the crime and also the syndicate. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Honorable Mbuyani. Honorable Malamacha.
Thank you, Chair. Let me also join the other leadership in welcoming the presentation. And I want to confess it's a presentation that really highlighted the number of factors that were hidden, a number of factors that from a distance others thought what we are seeing is much, only to realize today that actually it goes deeper. But I want to let the committee know that if we don't have such approach as the minister is doing, in a form of being proactive, we'll always be reactive, and it's not what we're elected for. I think the executive has done a very good job to be proactive, and the proposal can't wait any further. If we are to take we're going to test in a form of Mbizo consultation, the question will be, is the very same people who lamented that, as I speak to you now, they cannot get a train from Johannesburg, Cape Town to Messina. So the executive have proacted in to ensure that instead of lamenting and doing everything, let's come with this so that we kept this crime. It can't be correct that everything that has to be done, it has to go the route that it is already being the product of that lamentation and sorrow of the South Africans who are saying this metal scrap has been long staying, kept this thing, because if you don't keep it, it is doing a harm and damage to the economy. As we speak now, everything has to rely on other mode of transport, whereas we have a reliable and cheap mode. And now that reliable and cheap mode of transport has been destroyed by the very same thing. Now the executive is coming with this, then we are referring to that. And Chairperson, allow me to say, it's not every proposal that has got intention of corruption. And that is tantamount to say the thief executive of Cyril Ramaphosa is very corrupt, because everything that we're coming to bring on the board, it is tantamount to can be corrupt, it can be likened to other things. We are saying here, when we deal with economy, this is what we think can work best and be proactive and ensure that we improve the economy that is busy going down, and going down by those who are earning and working on the very same economy, but supporting it. So, Minister, I want to thank you very much, and I wish if the committee can understand that we are together in this economy. It's not us and them. We must not play politics in this. Otherwise, I can tell you, we are going nowhere. Because people want to just derail you. Come 2024, then they said you did nothing. Whereas we are able to keep it. This is not far from the example I'm giving of the Zamazamas. We knew about the Zamazamas. When people are killed and everything's happening, we are accusing the executive of not being proactive. I think as the DTIC, you have done very well. Just let's buy in this thing and process this thing so that we are keeping this for the good of future South Africa, which is better and safe for all of us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Malamacha. Honorable Minister, there is the inputs from the Portfolio Committee. Can I hand over to you for some comments and response?
Well, thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you for the members of the committee on the comments that have been made and the suggestions that have been made. I'd like to perhaps start off with as it were, summary comment that faced with a problem of enormous magnitude, we've looked at how do we find measures that are appropriate to it, that's proportional and that can be effective. And all the advice we've relied on, they all point to the same thing, that you need multiple measures to disrupt the crime syndicates. And it's not measure A versus measure B. It may be a combination of A and B, and I'll go through that. And so while it's been very helpful to get the comments, they also provide an opportunity for us to set out a little bit more clearly the advice that we've received and what we're thinking through at the moment. So let me start with the comments by Honorable Cuthbert. Honorable Cuthbert makes 7 points, and I'd like to respond to those 7 points. The first point that Honorable Cuthbert makes is that this is a law enforcement problem, and it's solely a law enforcement solution that's required in the form of more effective policing, and the other measures that we're contemplating are not appropriate. Well, we hear Honorable Cuthbert's view. It is different to the view of a large number of different persons and institutions who have given us advice on this matter. We commissioned 2 research institutions outside of the DTIC officials themselves. Both of those research institutions, Genesis Analytics as well as TIPS, believe that a comprehensive response is needed, and we drew heavily from the insights that they have. The Department of Trade, Industry and Competition's officials have applied their mind to the matter, and they've come up to the conclusion that indeed a number of different measures are required in addition to policing. We've had the police themselves give us feedback, and they've given the view that they believe that there's more that they can do, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But in addition to that, they believe other measures are required. We've spoken to ministries responsible for infrastructure, colleagues who have to work every day with the reality of cable and metal theft. And they have consulted with the entities, and the advice that they've offered have been very clear that we need to have a number of different measures in place that we can deal with. And so, Honorable Cuthbert, it is true that policing must be an element of it. Absolutely right. It's a necessary condition. On its own, with the current system in place, it's not a sufficient condition. And the reason for that, I think, has been set out. I spent a bit of time in the presentation taking honorable members through that. We have 600,000 kilometers of network. These would be copper cable or steel, rail lines, all of which are potential targets. We've got hundreds of thousands of separate places, from a pothole cover to or drain cover to a school window, to a electricity substation, to a traffic light, which we as South Africans call robots. All of these are potential targets. So to assume that we can ask the police that they need to be there 24/7 watching every little bit is not a very viable strategy. It may be one of those glib, easy answers that's given, but when you govern, you can't govern with glibness. You've got to look at the reality of the problem that you face and then take measures commensurate with the problem that we face. And so I've taken a bit of time to take honorable members through the extraordinary measures that are being put in place by Transnet, by Eskom, by Telkom, by PRASA and others in order to address, let's call it, the security part. What can be done with drones and with cameras and with security officials and with patrols. We've used the provisions in the law to have municipal officers and officers in public entities given certain powers that would ordinarily be reserved for law enforcement agencies. And the message we get is that all of these are helpful, but they're not sufficient. And that the sufficiency comes in when we look at the additional measures. The South African Police Service, for example, have been increasing their raids across the country. I gave just a sample of examples with the news clips that we provided in this presentation, the clippings from various newspapers and tweets and websites where citizens and others have indicated the kind of work. Journalists have reported on the work of SAPS. SAPS have also been setting up infrastructure task teams deployed in hotspot areas. There'll be a further public launch by SAPS in September. And there's been more arrests that have been made by the police. And more focus is also now being put on intel, on ensuring that we're able to understand better and the police better understand the networks themselves, so that we get to ultimately addressing the nerve centers of these syndicates. But while we're doing that, there are large numbers of public infrastructure where ordinary citizens are being incentivized to steal by these syndicates on the basis that they would make easy money. And we as a society know that that's not easy money because we pay an enormous cost on it. So Honorable Cuthbert, to the extent that you say law enforcement must be part of the mix, then we agree. To the extent that you say this is purely and utterly and only a problem that the police must address in the current with the current regulatory frame, then respectfully, the facts don't bear out that contention. It's one that we don't agree with. Now, some of the measures we're contemplating will make policing easier. So the very point, Honorable Cuthbert, that is made, which is a fair point, that policing is a critical element of what needs to be done. That policing is enhanced when there are registers by which the purchasing is recorded and the sale is recorded. And down the line, when we get the legislation in place where cash transactions are not permitted for scrap metal. So those are measures that will take a little bit of time to put in place. In the meantime, And I thought, given Honourable Cuthbert's previous comments on how much he enjoyed his economics courses, that Honourable Cuthbert, that you'd appreciate the law of demand and supply. When you have a massive demand, as there is with both the combination of domestic demand and exports, then when the supply is low, the legitimate supply of things that are genuinely scrapped and that we need to recycle, then what happens is the price goes up. When the price goes up, then of course we have a greater financial incentive for people to act illegally. There's a good point that Honourable Jaco Mulder makes, which I want to endorse, that we also need to accompany this by what Honourable Mulder calls a moral regeneration campaign, a set of measures in which we are able to show in society the enormous cost that is borne by the society, the damage to hospitals that can't operate because their power is cut, because cable is stolen or metal is stolen. And so those are all helpful suggestions of what we need to do. The second point that Honourable Cuthbert makes is that the export volumes of ferrous metal, scrap metal, has gone down, whilst a range of what we would call semi-processed products have gone up. And Honourable Cuthbert says, have a look there. That shows you that any measure you're contemplating cannot work. And then Honourable Cuthbert later, having made the comment, also asks a question. He says he'd like me to indicate, in my opinion, why did scrap metal exports decline? So I'd like to offer Honourable Cuthbert two answers. The one answer is to briefly explain it. The other answer is to encourage Honourable Cuthbert to also look at the documentations that we have gazetted and which is publicly available, and which I did ask the team to make available to members of the committee, because therein lies the answers, and the answers have been provided so well that I probably can't do a better job. For example, in paragraph 246 of the Gazette, and I'm just finding it, 246, it says, under the export pathway, and I quote, it says, as noted, well, it starts actually with 245. It says, as noted above, stolen scrap metal may be exported as scrap or transformed into either semi-finished or finished metal and then exported. In addition, traders often make false declarations for their exports. Copper scrap is often declared under a non-copper export HS code, e.g. steel or another metal. Moreover, scrap metal is routinely exported under a semi-finished HS code, even when the product is still in scrap form and has not been processed into semi-finished product. Exporters utilize this tactic to evade the more stringent conditions currently applied to scrap exports, including the application of the price preference system and export duties. And then it goes on in providing more information. So what the approach, I should probably also quote paragraph 249. Paragraph 249 says, another difficulty is that low-cost smelters or shredders can currently be purchased on international markets at relatively low cost. Once scrap has been melted into billets or chopped and shredded, the original source of the metal cannot be identified. Thieves and syndicates can then operate in the openly storing, trucking, and coordinating the buying and selling of shredded, melted metal, both locally and across the border. So that's what's happened to date. And in order to address that in the context of theft, the proposals include not only dealing with the scrap metal that I exported, let's call it the raw product, but also semi-processed product. It has a range of proposals dealing with semi-processed products, and we would like to, of course, have the views of affected parties before finalizing that. And I can point Honorable Cuthbert to the measures in the Gazette, and indeed we've summed them up again in the presentation today. So there's no need really for me to speculate what the reason is. These criminal syndicates, when there is a regulation that they believe will block them, they find ways to evade it or avoid it. It's what happens all the time with all regulations. The tax system is replete with examples that the minute the tax commissioner, through the Minister of Finance, has a provision in place, then people seek ways of evading or avoiding. And so we've learned from that, and the measures that are contemplated now on semi-processed products would go a long way to addressing that, both in limiting the ability of people to disguise the content of stolen products, and that's where the furnace and other machinery provision is in place. These are, I should indicate, they're not being prohibited. They would just be licensed and regulated so that we're able to see where those, whether in fact these workshops are being used as chop shops to disguise the true origin, or melt shops to disguise the true origin. And I think you'll be pleased then, Honorable Cuthbert, that we've taken that into account. Will it be the last issue that there's an attempt at evasion? No. It's an ongoing battle when there are enormous profits to be made by unscrupulous businesses at the expense of honest, hardworking South Africans who run ethical businesses, who create jobs, who help to export legitimate products to the rest of the world, who help to provide that product to our country's infrastructure, including our energy system. We have to make a choice as a society. Are we going to make it easy for those who are benefiting from illegality, or do we disrupt their actions? In any act that we take, whatever it may be, there will be consequences for others, and we've got to keep those as limited. And that's why we're not proposing a 10-year prohibition on exports. It's a time-bound, quite focused one. It's intended to provide us with the space and the ability to reduce demand in the short term, while we put in place a more effective and less onerous system. Honorable Cuthbert then makes the third point. And the third point Honorable Cuthbert makes is that Kenya introduced a ban and then walked back on its measure and discontinued the ban. Honorable Cuthbert, I would encourage you again to go to that government gazette that I quoted. And if you look at the government gazette, you'll find in the gazette, it provides an interesting review of the international experience. For example, on page 16 of the gazette, it has paragraph 254, and it says there, Kenya recently imposed a full prohibition on all trade in scrap metal. In 2010, Kenya implemented an export prohibition on scrap metal that was formulated into law in 2015. However, this was insufficient to stop the increase in metal theft. In 2022, the Kenya government implemented the full prohibition on the trade of all scrap metal, which was only relaxed after the government had created a new trading regime, which includes a host of local restrictions and licensing requirements. So in other words, it seems that Kenya has followed an interesting path that is not dissimilar to what is being proposed. They put in place a prohibition initially, and then they developed a system which more details is provided. We've also hyperlinked in the Gazette some research reports that have been very interesting to look at. And those research go into a little bit of additional detail, not only involving Kenya, but also a number of other countries. So if it's helpful, Honorable Cuthbert, it could be useful to just have a look at those provisions. Then the fourth point that Honorable Cuthbert makes is, so you're proposing a prohibition on the export of certain classes of product for a period. Well, what are you going to do with it? Where does that go to? And Honorable Cuthbert, in the presentation, we've anticipated that question, and we've dealt with the question quite extensively, as honorable members will recall, where we took the honorable members in detail through what is the work that has been done by the external researchers who have set out how they believe the system would work. Some of that I covered in slide number 33, 34, and 35, dealing with likely impact. And essentially what these slides say on this matter is it's temporary for a 6-month period. So it's not contemplated to be forever. In that period, there's still a domestic market that can services at least some of that product. When the system has been fully developed and designed, which we hope would be completed within that 6-month period, then of course such scrap as has been legitimately and properly obtained and can be explained are capable of being exported. In that 6-month period, there will be at least to some extent a market for product. Now, in policy, when we have to make choices, we have to recognize that there are costs with any choice that we make. If you do nothing, which is a choice, it will be a massive cost to the society. And I'll come back to that in a moment. If we simply say, let's only increase the number of raids by the police, it's the advice that we've received to date that won't be sufficient, that will lead still a very significant market that will be satisfied through illegal means. And so the cost on the society is enormous. If we take the measures that are contemplated in the Gazette, there is a cost. There's no question about it. And some players will pay that cost, even if it is for a given period. But policy is about weighing up all the costs that different players may have visited on them, all the benefits that different players may have, to look at how society as a whole benefits or loses on any measure. And that weighing task is what policy is about. When you make a decision, the decision comes following a careful weighing up of all the costs and all the benefits. We as citizens do the same. Every time we go into a shop, or we do something at work, or we do something in our personal lives, on the sport field, we have to make choices. With every choice comes advantages and strengths and benefits, and it comes a cost or a challenge or a difficulty. If we want to be fit, it leads to healthier lives, but it means getting up early morning to go jogging, or it means sweating through in the evening when we do go for our run or for our walk or whatever it may be. This is choices that we make all the time. Simply to point to the cost without recognizing the enormous benefits will lead to no decisions, weak decisions, or bad decisions. So we've tried to take all of that into account. The reason why we've also published the document for public comment is to give those affected parties who may believe that we haven't fully taken into account either the cost or the benefits, an additional opportunity to come back to us. There may be something we've not taken into account. It's possible. It's not something that we're defensive about. If it's something we haven't thought through, there's an opportunity for someone to write us a document in 1 page or 10 pages to say, bear in mind that this is a cost that you need to take into account. Or if there's a benefit that our proposed measures have for society and we haven't recognized that, and someone writes in and say, in terms of combating theft, bear in mind that those measures can have this positive effect on fighting theft and the criminal syndicates. And then we'll take all of that into account and we'll weigh them up carefully and make a decision based on all the advice that is available that we can take into account. Honorable Cuthbert's 5th point is that the true cost of the measures needs to be identified, and the true cost of the criminal syndicates needs to be taken into account. And Honorable Cuthbert puts up a number of 187 billion rand, which is some of the information that has been put in by some of the calculations that have been done. We just cited today the cost that Genesis Analytics, which is a well-respected independent research body, has put up. And Genesis said to us, in the available time, they had not done a complete costing of all the damage to the economy, to business confidence, to public institutions, and to the rights that citizens have to be able to have access to transport without trains being derailed because there's been theft. The rights to energy, which should not be interrupted because copper cable has been stolen or the electricity substation has been vandalized. So the true cost is significantly above the 46 billion rand, as we've indicated in here. And that should concentrate the mind with such an enormous cost that the society faces. Some extraordinary measures are warranted, and I appreciate that Honorable Cuthbert has helped to make the argument for us. The cost on the society is not only financial, there's also all the non-financial costs that we've highlighted, and that should also be taken into account. Honorable Cuthbert's 6th point is that waste pickers will be negatively affected. The previous ban, why does the presentation say that there was minimal harm? What will happen to the wheelbarrows and stoves that can no longer be collected? And the truth is, Honorable Cuthbert, that as regards the waste pickers, we've taken into account the disruption that any measure to deal with this can have across the board. And there is indeed a set of persons who are involved in waste collection. Not all of that is in scrap metal, Honorable Cuthbert. A lot of it is in the collection of plastic, collection of paper, and other waste products, which are not affected by the measures that we've put in place here. There's also been a range of other measures that have been done. We've looked, among others, at work that has been done by one of the UN agencies dealing with the informal waste pickers. UNIDO, which is a UN agency, has indicated that the waste pickers, of course, would still be able to, and they currently collect glass, plastic, paper scrap, and there's also a really good opportunity for the waste pickers to formalize their work into businesses that can then register and get the benefits of the trading regime that is being put in place. So I would be looking forward to those steps that can be taken. And we should not worry that the wheelbarrows will be lying in the driveways, Honourable Cuthbert. There is still a legitimate business, even in the 6-month period, in which steel mini mills and foundries and steel mills utilize scrap metal, and that will be that business will continue, and there's an opportunity to address that. Honourable Cuthbert's 7th point is, and I think it's in the form of advice to me, which is there's lobbying by industrial groups on the minister to do this so that they can benefit. And I'm assuming Honourable Cuthbert is probably talking about South African producers who use metal and often in these cases scrap metal to produce products for our infrastructure program, Honourable Cuthbert, and for a range of the supermarkets or shopping malls we're in, the energy supply, the transport, they make those products. I would be very keen to hear their view. And we believe the products that they make are absolutely vital to South Africans. Without those steel mini mills and those foundries, not only would the jobs be lost there, but where will we find the products that we build, the infrastructure that we build, Honourable Cuthbert, given that you and I and all the honourable members here are keen that South Africa must have energy supply, we must have power stations, we must have all the things that require the products from those foundries and those steel mini mills. And so if they have views, that would be taken into account. But they're not the originators of this proposal. This proposal comes from parties, including the police and a number of public entities that have to deal with the theft from public infrastructure. And so the industrial interests are legitimate. And if they were behind this proposal, I would have no difficulty in saying that they do. But this one comes from a different source. And when I deal with Honourable Mbuyani's interesting question, I'll elaborate a little bit further on this. So concluding then, Honourable Cuthbert, you've said that you would welcome that various parties should brief Parliament on it. Of course, in our constitutional order, the executive has to exercise the power and responsibility that it has in terms of the Constitution. So as the executive, we are obliged to act on the problem. We want to take into account the view of the various stakeholders. So we've given them an opportunity to make comments. We want to, I thought it's very helpful to also hear the views of members of Parliament, even though members of Parliament will be responsible ultimately for oversight of any measures that we put in place. But nonetheless, it'll be good to have an opportunity to hear the thoughts, the proposals, the ideas from members of Parliament. The more we hear, the better our ultimate decision-making can be. Sometimes it will simply reinforce our view about something. Sometimes it will challenge that view and get us to sit back and think a little bit more carefully about the matter. But those views are helpful. But as the executive, we need to do what is within our constitutional responsibility, and that is to act swiftly on problems that are brought to our attention, as this one has been. So I've covered Honourable Cuthbert in a bit more detail because Honourable Cuthbert was the first speaker, and so I can leverage off that in my response to the other honourable members' comments. Honourable Mulder, thank you for your insight into the work that you've done previously in seeking to deal with similar challenges at provincial level. That's very helpful. to take note of that. And also, I think you make an interesting point that there are certain products in any society where special measures may be necessary. In our case, we have special measures involving diamonds, liquor, drugs, you point out. There are also other products that have either controls or various measures in place. And scrap has now become one of those, given the impact that we have. I agree, Honorable Mulder, with your point that there needs to be the moral argument to communities that communities need to act against cable and metal theft by reporting every example where that happens, by refusing to provide a supportive environment for people who have done harm to South Africa by stealing cable and metal. And so the law is only one element. We've already, some years ago, Parliament has already agreed to a massive stepping up of measures to deal with cable and metal theft by requiring or by increasing the sentencing to up to 30 years, by limiting bail conditions, by creating a special offense. But there is so much that policing can do. We need other measures. We need measures to disrupt the logistics, to disrupt the way in which the networks can take thousands and thousands of collection points and monetize it in only a few channels. And it's those few channels that are monetized where we're seeking to focus the effort so that we can be even more effective in this. And I would only urge Honorable Mulder that you support us in the wide range of measures that have been taken, given the damage that you would no doubt pick up when you do visits to constituents and they complain about the problems of energy, transport, hospitals that are offline, all the kind of inconvenience and sometimes quite serious damage that citizens and businesses are affected by. Honorable Burns Namashi makes a really important contribution around regional coordination. Indeed, we've already briefed trade ministers in SACU countries of the challenge that we face, and we've indicated to them that we will be seeking support in both law enforcement, but also in coordination to deal with the cross-border aspects to this trade. And so your comments about that fits very nicely in with the thinking that we have, Honorable Burns Namashi. Honorable Mbuyani, thank you for the comments where you've highlighted not only the damage of theft, but also that we've taken measures previously to address the shortage of supply in the domestic market. We found that those measures were adequate, they were fit for purpose, and even though there had been some degree of public criticism of them in the form of both the price preference system and the export tax, they worked. They helped to provide a supply of raw material to domestic producers, and they've also helped South Africa to meet our climate change goals better, because when you process scrap metal in your foundries or in your mini mills or in your steel mills, the energy intensity is lower than if you use iron ore. So we've resolved that one. These measures are not intended to address any shortage of supply in the domestic market. These measures are intended to address, as you rightly say, theft of metal and copper cable. On the question of ITAC, ITAC has been part of the team of entities that have been assisting, advising, providing the benefit of their experience, because not only are they responsible for trade administration, but very importantly, they've also had some prior experience with a price preference system that has been put in place. So they will also form an important part of the design of the system. On the policy itself, of course, ITAC will await a trade directive. I have published a draft trade directive that would go to ITAC for public comment. And after the public comment is concluded, I'll apply my mind to the representations and thereafter decide on the matter. And if we issue that trade directive, then ITAC would bring the administrative systems in place. Then on the syndicates, Honorable Mbuyani, it's really quite an important point because very large businesses appear to have been built on cable and metal theft. The officials tell me that there's been reports of even special training facilities that have been set up. That has been reported in one publication by, if I recall, Business Leadership South Africa, that makes the point on this. So you have quite a sophisticated network that have found an opportunity to plunder, to destroy, to damage public infrastructure solely that they can get their hands on the metal and on the copper and make money out of it, sell it, export it, disguise it with melting and chopping and shredding and compacting. And for those businesses whose business model is based on encouraging, turning a blind eye, or even actively facilitating theft of scrap and copper cable, the proposals in the government gazette is bad news for them. It's bad news for them. It will disrupt their business model and it will make it difficult for them to monetize the value of the stolen product that they have. For businesses that run an ethical, proper, lawful business, they will find that beyond the 6-month period, they can adjust their business model to what we're putting in place. And for the very large number of businesses that are affected by cable and metal theft, businesses that have to close because a substation is vandalized and the metal is stolen, businesses that lose their energy, but businesses whose workers arrive late at work because the train line wasn't operating in the Cape metro area, whatever it may be, those costs, those businesses, I believe, would by and large welcome the kind of measures that we've put in place. They may come up with specific ideas that refine them, make them either tougher or relax them a little bit, strengthen them in one or other respect, make them easier to monitor, whatever it may be. That's the value that we'll get out of the public process. But I want to highlight the urgency of dealing with this. When the president addressed the nation on the energy crisis, it was about government moving into a expedited mode on any matter relating to energy. And this one does also affect the energy supply that ordinary South Africans have. So I really appreciate, Chairperson, the opportunity to respond to the issue around the syndicates that had been raised. Honorable Malemacha has made the point that in many cases, there's a complaint. It could be a complaint that a member of parliament or a constituent of a member of parliament or a cabinet member or a member of a provincial executive raises about the price we're all paying as a result of cable or metal theft. And so that's in the one column of our brain of what we say. In the other column, we put in the measures that are proposed now. And these two columns need to talk to each other. In other words, because there is a problem, we will need to do things differently. And yes, we need policing. We need effective policing. And the police have, and we've shown with a number of these press clips, really widespread action by the police against cable and metal theft. And the police themselves have said that they believe other measures would be required that can complement and support what they have have in mind. And that's what this is about. So thank you, Honorable Marimachi. You've, I think, really put it very well, how we need to reconcile those two parts of the issue, the problem and the solution, and connect them in the manner that you have proposed. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. I just want to note the message by Honourable Mutawung saying that she supports the draft policy proposals that have been gazetted, but she has a challenge with her speaker. So I'm just, for the record, reading that into the record that she's proposing support for the draft proposals. I also just want to appeal to Honourable Cuthbert. As far as I'm concerned, and you will correct me if I'm wrong, Minister, we have until the end of the week for stakeholders and public at large to comment on the draft proposals. So please do whatever you can to get those parties that you feel have not been covered to make comment on the draft proposals. Honourable Mbuyani, I saw your hand.
No, thank you very much, Chair. I also wanted to raise as a whip that we support the initiative by the Cabinet because really this thing has a serious impact in the economy and also in the infrastructure of our country. The cable theft of more than 400,000 kilometers, it's a lot, and 4 billion is a lot of money. So I think this gazette can be able at least to assist us moving forward, Chairperson. This is what I just wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that will bring us to the conclusion of our meeting. We're finishing a bit early. Can I then just ask the Secretariat if there's any announcements, as we thank the Minister and his team who was present in our meeting today to make for making this presentation to the Portfolio Committee and for listening to members and their inputs. Thank you very much, Minister.
Chairperson, if I may?
Secretariat? Yes.
Chair, we're just informing members that we will be redistributing the fourth quarter financial and non-financial report of the DTIC. It was distributed in the third quarter, so we will just redistribute it for today, and also request members who wish to submit concluding remarks to do so by the end of business today. I think the ANC was the only party that submitted some concluding remarks in the third quarter, but it's still open for parties to submit concluding remarks, and we'll distribute it soon after the meeting. Chair, thank you.
Thank you. And you will then also just indicate the deadline for the submission by other parties.
Yes, Chair, end of business today, Chair. That we will appreciate it because we're considering it tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. That concludes our deliberations. And we wish the department well and the Minister and his team well with the important work that they are doing around the scrap metal problem in the country. Thank you very much, Minister and team.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you also to all the comments by honourable members. And we'll certainly take note of all of the comments. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Long live the Chair. Long live the Chair.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Recording stopped.